It is really a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to Banu and Anne for inviting me, and anyone who had any say in my being invited to be the Leslie Scalapino Memorial Lecturer. So I will say that I'm still obsessed with some of the themes that Banu talked about in her introduction. But what I didn't know until like yesterday is that there was a frame for the week, which is how to grieve and dream at the same time. And so I kind of restructured what I would present today to address, however obliquely, maybe it's directly now, I don't know, that framework in which folks are thinking through this week. I also developed a cold, like at around noon. I started getting like gradually, like these cold symptoms coming over me. So if I pass out, that'll be part of it. You know, just you know, don't like wheel me out or anything. Just put me back on, you know, up against this microphone and make me finish. Okay, so let's the titles. So that is the title, but now there are addenda. So now I'm going to talk about that stuff, and I'm going to talk about melancholia and grief and race. And in some ways, the discomfort that I'm thinking about has to do with the racialized body. And in fact, you know, sometimes the racialized body in this lecture actually stands in for discomfort. And then the question really becomes, what do you do with that as somebody who makes things in the world? What kind of poetics might that be? Or what kind of poetics might that inspire? And just a note on process. So I'll start with a kind of preamble just about my kind of approach to the lecture. Before I did 4 short lectures. This time I'm doing 7 short lectures. And I'll say that this time for me is really a time to think through things with you. So it doesn't purport to be a finished product by any means. And, you know, through my work in these capacities, the work just continues to develop and is kind of never finished. It's a thinking through about the work of art and making. And it's a kind of struggle, I think, on the page, a wrestling within a possible idea or toward an idea or set of ideas. Thus, the struggle of my talking will be multivocal. The voice is in my head. It will include questions that go unanswered, lots of them, in fact, that I hope will generate questions for you in the Q&A part. They're questions that press nonetheless sometimes and evoke this thing that we call the lecture. I'll make assumptions that will sometimes contradict each other. I'll say that. But I like that. I think that there's a way in which sometimes in the academy we're forced to be sure, to be the kind of arbiters and creators of a stable kind of knowledge. And for me, that doesn't really do much to my thinking. I like instead a kind of laboratory work, putting things next to each other that sometimes don't go to each other and being forced to read in those interstices. And so I'll read you first how Kathleen Fraser talks about the laboratory. I really love what she says. This is a long quote. The laboratory is a workspace in which to look closely at the evidences you've assembled. I cannot conceive of a nothing space, but perhaps it is like a large internal screen continuously being filled with the writer's bits of thought, overheard speech, observation, all somewhat loosely and raggedly noted, but not as yet brought to any kind of focus or coherence. The evidence is there waiting until some work or physical response brings one's focus to the screen. Thought hunts and selects and assembles language, and a shape begins to build, whose edges might describe a parameter. That's the end of her quote. These ragged bits are what interest me more than anything that might reach towards coherence. Coherence seems to me an artificial glaze over the organic. This talk, sometimes I think, I'll make a talk that's just like, these like preamble and then a preamble and then, kind of around it. And then, I'll never get to the talk, but I hope that doesn't happen here. Maybe it will. Against the foreclosed, the adornment. Against the foreclosed, the adornment is race and adornment. Who noticed when the black body entered the room? I certainly did. Blackness itself, a fissure, a tear in the imagined coherence of culture, of sociality, of discourse, of order. 1, the body grieves in its heart chest. Conventional wisdom has it that grief is what happens in the wake of loss. The hand reaches out to grasp the lost object, but it is not there. Instead, ghost space. Instead, hand floating, emptiness, undoing. In order to grieve, you must remember. Even if remembering is a non-space, is more like a feeling than an image. Some say writing is an act of remembering. What has forever been lost? What is there a grief writing? Is there a language of grief? What is the language of the whale but the whale, W-A-I-L? Is there such a thing as mute subjectivity? Or do we become animal in the grief state, beast? What speech do we have when we are crawling around on the kitchen floor? I am thinking here of death and what happens in its wake. What do we say when the loved one is lost, unreachable? What language is left? Or do we end language? Are we at its end? If we are at its end, then what else can occur? When my father died, he was very small, melting almost into death. I could not reach him, so he came to me. First as a green light under the bed, then as a tall black man in a cowboy hat at a bar. He sent messages through the man. I said nothing, but this nothing was also something, a thing between the transient presence and the gravity of absence. The nothing was a without language, but not a no thing, quite the opposite, breathing up through fissures. 2, when grief will not transform the melancholic state. We are forever lost. We hold our identities so dear, but they are also lost to us. What am I when I make a claim to you of being in this skin? If I say that I am black, what do you know about my interior, about my being? So this is slide number 1, which is Adrian Piper's My Calling card, number 1 from 1986. And some of you will be familiar with this. Can you see that okay? So she would hand these cards out. This was a kind of performance piece that she did, a public performance piece. And if you know Adrian Piper, she's a very light-skinned black woman, a conceptual artist, and a philosopher. Dear friend, I am black. I am sure you did not realize this when you made, laughed at, agreed with that racist remark. In the past, I have attempted to alert white people to my racial identity in advance. Unfortunately, this invariably causes them to react to me as pushy, manipulative, or socially inappropriate. Therefore, my policy is to assume that white people do not make these remarks, even when they believe there are no black people present, and to distribute this card when they do. I regret any discomfort my presence is causing you, just as I am sure you regret the discomfort your racism is causing me. Sincerely yours, Adrian Margaret Smith Piper. When grief persists, it is irreconcilable. It morphs into melancholia, the outstretched arm, the hand now cut off. Adrian Piper's calling card does not affect the state of racial melancholia in which our identities perpetually exist. Her calling card is critical intervention into racist speech, references, as Claudia Rankine says, the condition of being addressable, but it will not save us. Loss is at the heart of both identity and writing. We must reckon with this fact. To ignore it is to live in the fictional safe house of the imagined womb. To call our identities into our mouths as if we know them is to recognize what cannot be recognized. I'll just take a break to say one of the things I love about this calling card is the slippery nature, how it inscribes, this, as much as it's calling into view racist speech and critiquing it, it's also acknowledging the slippery nature of what the speech, the object of the speech, right? The race itself. To call our identities into our mouths as if we know them is to recognize what cannot be recognized. And there is where the melancholia thrives. Here is Roland Barthes from The Death of the Author, quote, writing, I'm not that huge fan of Barthes, I just like this quote. Writing is that neutral, let me just say, writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting at the very identity of the body writing. That's the end of the quote. In its place, we get the text as matter, or text as body, those things come into being. What can the text as body say about subjectivity, and how does it speak? And where does it speak? And what are the conditions within which subjectivity is possible? Where are the conditions in which it's not possible? I'm kind of leaning here towards this way in which, the attempt to write there's something I think about the contemporary moment and how we think about all identities almost, all disparaged identities, let me say, where writing it becomes increasingly difficult. So, if on the one hand, writing itself kind of, robs subjectivity, and then you have particular subjectivities that want to be imagined in writing, then that too is a problem. So this is this work, something I'm trying to work through about this kind of layering, the layering of the impossibility. So here's another complication. The condition of race subjectivity is also the condition of melancholia. The condition of race subjectivity is also the condition of melancholy. Here's why. As David Eng notes, quote, the melancholic is so militant in his or her denials that the lost object is finally incorporated into the self, turned in to shelter the ego, and preserved as a form of ghostly identification. In this refusal to sever any attachment to the lost object, the melancholic becomes instead haunted by it. That's the end of that quote. Usually, when we think of the lost object, we think of something that exists outside of ourselves, a time, some kind of nostalgia for a lost time, a loved one, an object, a sentimental object, something, right? In racial melancholia, the lost object exists within oneself. The melancholic's attachment to the lost object obstructs any desire to be unburdened by this persistent state of longing or to heal. The lost object eventually gets incorporated into the ego, becoming a part of the melancholic's subject sense of self. There's a reason why I specialize. I think that all subjects have a kind of melancholic element to it, but again, I specialize the grief of racial minorities as particular, not merely because of the degree to which the collective trauma has been experienced historically, although that's a part of it, and the degree to which that history and memory has an impact on contemporary social relations, although that's a part of it. I'm specializing the grief of the race subject a lot because of the degree to which the object of loss is socially denigrated. If we accept Lacan's theory that all human psyches are irreversibly affected by the identification with the mother and later the inevitable separation from the mother, then racial subjectivity is a fragmented self within a fragmented self. Eng argues that women, homosexuals, people of color, and post-colonials are all coerced to relinquish and yet to identify with socially disparaged objects on their psychic paths to subjectivity. The ambivalent attachment to devalued objects comes to define, indeed produce, our subjectivities. In this description, the melancholic's ambivalence is created because he or she is both subject and object, a being that is created via the perception of others and one who identifies with and rejects those perceptions. One sees oneself through the eyes of another, a la W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of double consciousness, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. All right, that's Du Bois. What locks this melancholic into this disposition, however, is not singularly the relationship between the self and the other, but also the relationship between the self and the phantasmatic self, the shadow of the ghost. Racial melancholia refers to the notion of the racial self that is an entirely constructed and devalued entity. What kind of speech could possibly attend to the melancholia of the racially marked body, perennially trying to gather itself, make itself whole and true despite every effort to obliterate it, make it stab itself in its own eye? Impossibility, especially given its irreconcilability. Its discomfort might be, in fact, what compels or calls forth the creative. This is the condition of making from a place of not knowing. 3, a note on my mother. So there's my mother. And that's me, obviously. I just thought, if I'm going to talk about her, you might as well see what she looks like. A racial injustice can be a big, fat, rusty nail sticking out of the sidewalk, visible and deadly. But sometimes racism is like a word repeated over and over until we lose grasp. Belt, 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 belt. This is its wanton trick. Like a trauma, the experience of racism can take up location in a dark corner of the body, and though corporeal, as Ta-Nehisi Coates makes clear, racism is also the black ghost in the dead of night, no moon, the nightmare you buried in your unconscious long ago. My mother, who was born over 80 years ago deep in the Jim Crow South, claims she has never experienced a single moment of racism. I know this isn't true. I have never heard her say a derogatory word about white people as a race, or derogatory word about a white person where she uses the word white. When she uses the word black to refer to black people, she does not do so affectionately as a designation of kinship, community, or belonging. And, most disturbingly, she is visibly annoyed when black people organize around blackness itself, as if to suggest that to claim the very category used to disparage black people is a criminal act. Why excite the ghost? Why call its hideous name? Yet, when I ask her if she remembers from her youth black people getting lynched, she says, yeah, they did sometimes. This is what race trauma looks like, yet it is not reducible to that. 4, evidences 1. On Kerouac's site-specific installation at the Domino Sugar Factory titled A Subtlety or the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens to the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. Commissioned, so I talked a little bit about this at the Philosophia conference in Denver, but I did not have slides for them, but I have slides for you because maybe I like you guys better, I don't know. But I do have slides just in case folks are not familiar with this exhibition. I'll just talk a little bit about it to give you a sense of what it is. So commissioned by Creative Time, this is Walker's first public art piece as well as her first large-scale sculptural work. Enter the warehouse and the nostrils sting with the abundantly sweet waft of sugar and molasses, just like home, Mama's kitchen always alight in confections. Amongst the refinery's dead artifacts, the rusted chutes, long empty bins, frozen pulleys, and stone posts, other factory things. We are welcomed by a trail of sugar and resin boy figurines already melting and standing in puddles of their own shrinking bodies. Some of the brown boys have objects thrown over their shoulders. Some appear to be leaking. Already melting and standing in puddles of their own shrinking bodies. Some of the brown boys have objects thrown over their shoulders. Some appear to be leaking or imploding around the eyes. Some carry baskets on their backs. Others carry baskets with their hands in front. In the baskets, a crystalline substance. And in some cases, the macabre, heads, arms, and legs from fallen boys. Walker calls this a poetic gesture, one emergent from failed figurines as she tried to figure out the sugar construction sustainable in sculpture, and the effect is startling, hearkening back to the explicit violence of her drawings in Dust Jackets for the Niggerati 2011, where heads of full raced caricature might find themselves on posts stuck. This persistent reference to the violence of America's racist past is Walker's primary lens for illuminating the present. Toward the back of the warehouse, we find what we have come to see, the grand dame sugar baby herself made from the glorious white confection. She is part lion, part mammy, part guardian. In The New Yorker, Hilton Als is optimistic about this figure, which for him indicates both the past wildly unyoked from its tether, but also a dignified resilience. The Sphinx, he says, crouches in a position that's regal and yet totemic of subjugation. She is beat down, but standing. And this is true. Walker is adept at using the master's tools to rattle the master's house, despite Audre Lorde's deep skepticism about that possibility. The subtlety is indeed, as Als puts it, triumphant, but not merely because, taken one way, she gives us the finger. The position of the thumb on the left hand/paw could symbolize either fertility, good luck, or it could also mean fuck you. Its triumph lies in the belly, which, like the trajectory of the racial imaginary, is unseen, like whiteness itself. That the Sphinx is white is perhaps the point underneath any homage to the worker, the slave, the violated black body. Whiteness organizes itself and maintains its power through invisibility. Whiteness is unnamed and presumed, and this is the means by which it gathers and maintains its authority. And I'm actually paraphrasing a talk that Claudia Rankine and Beth Lofreda did during my time at Naropa a couple of years ago. The giantness of the whiteness of the Sphinx, whose nose is wide, lips full, head tied in a butterfly kerchief, exposes whiteness and its artifice. Walker takes our loathed mammy figure, casts her in a transcendent mythical light, dots her field with Negro cherubs, and builds her via a white depth, all 75 by 35 feet of her. This looming whiteness unveils a cover-up Walker winks. What I'm excited by in this and other work by Walker is less the wink and more how she makes violence and the violence of race, gendered caricature center to her aesthetics, which is, as she often notes, the laying bare of the American imagination. The way that in the sculpture, whiteness or the power of whiteness is also what makes the violence inescapable. It's my belief that there's probably not a person in this room, including myself, probably not a person in this country whose imagination is free from the violent images, the violence of images infused with the violence of racial caricature. It happens in your imagination without your consent. Like, that's where we live. Like, that's the country we live in. That's the world we live in. Be it a noticing something in a woman you see on the bus or a certain fear. Another example of this is actually from Gertrude Stein. I really love this example because it's like she has a kind of racist Tourette's, you know. So this is from Melancholia. So I'll read you the whole quote, even though you just have a bit of it there. So she's describing in Melancholia Rose Johnson. This is what she says. Rose Johnson was a real black, tall, well-built, sullen, stupid, childlike, good-looking negress. She laughed when she was happy and grumbled and was sullen with everything that troubled. Rose Johnson was a real black negress, but she had been brought up quite like their own child by white folks. Rose laughed when she was happy, but she had not the wide, abandoned laughter that makes the warm, broad glow of Negro sunshine. It's like what is a warm, broad glow of Negro sunshine? Rose was never joyous with the earth-born, boundless joy of Negroes. Hers was just ordinary, any sort of woman laughter. Like, she's trying to do good here, you know, in the end, but she just can't help but also in the middle have these images that are just, you know, saturated with racial bias. The presence, the largeness of the ghost in the American imagination. One of the things that has been on my mind when I was kind of preparing to come to Colorado is I've been thinking a lot about where we are culturally and where we are particularly, you know, around conversations in poetry and lots of progressives and left-leaning folks and academics and neoliberals and, you know, all of us. We've created this culture of refusal in which what abounds are attempts to shield us from that which might harm us, even though the harm is inside of us. It's as if to say, you know, the harm is over there, so we gotta protect ourselves over here because we have nothing to do with the harm, but we all have something to do with the harm. And I think a lot about the reception around Citizen, which is an amazing book by Claudia Rankine, which I love, but nobody is really inside the book. Everyone's outside of the book, you know, right? Because we want to be on the good side of things. We want to be those who want to be good people. And if I put my hand to your mouth to prevent your callous, thoughtless, racist, and/or sexist utterance, is this an act that shifts what's quaking underneath? This is a real question that I have. Does it shift what's quaking underneath? What undergirds the indeterminate and persistent collision of fractures at the heart of our imagination? It strikes me, too, that Walker, who spent months kind of planning for this exhibition, brainstorming. There's like all these videos of her trying to figure out what she wanted to do in this exhibition, but that it is in the accident, the slip, the thing that she didn't intend, the thing that escapes without her consent, the failure that leads her towards and produces her poetic gesture. And that this gesture is also where the violence of the sugar trade is made most explicit. This feels really key to me. So I guess I'm wondering if this might be something like dream space, like that space of like accident, of misfortune, of mishap, when something seeps out without our consent in the act of making something, if that might be more like dream space, a kind of poetics that shifts radically from protectionism towards something more akin to what happened in that moment for Walker, that dream space might be dangerous. Because I'm actually a person who rarely remembers my dreams. When I do, it's like the most startling thing ever. So it's always dangerous for me, to have a memory of something that happened while I was sleeping in particular. I have 3 more sections, but I'm going to skip this one. So it's going to take me a minute to reorganize. I will read a part of it. So this is a section of epigraphs, even though they happen in the middle of this talk. The epigraphs are, in some ways kind of breathing up. And the one epigraph that I'll read you is from Johannes Goransson, and he says, "We have a culture which is obsessed with obscenity. Everything is obscene and therefore should not be talked about. It's not, I disagree with you, it's, this should not have been said. Like, it shouldn't have been said in the first place. This is an obscenity. The Chinese said it was obscene that Obama mentioned Ferguson in his talk about the Middle East, as if there's something obscene about Ferguson and it can't even be mentioned. And as you know, obscene is from the Latin to be held out of sight, right? To hold something in the dark. And I think this is important because when we want to protect ourselves, when we want to pretend that everything is hunky-dory, we want to hide from view, experience, anything that might cause us pain and discomfort. But as the Reverend Desmond Tutu once said in an interview with my friend, the poet scholar Erica Hunt, there are no safe spaces. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that pain and that discomfort? Oh, so the next section is a comment on the epigraphs. This is 6. The system, as Stefano Harney and Fred Moten point out in Undercommons, denies its brokenness. The quote-unquote system denies its brokenness and insists on cohesiveness. For those who tend to and manage the system, the only part of the system that's broken is us, the Black, the queer, the indigenous, the poor. It's interesting to me that that gender is not mentioned in that moment. And so it's a weird way, it seems like right and, also wrong. And actually, that moment was written by my other friend, Juliana Spar, who writes the introduction and Undercommons. And, I feel like that gender is probably one of the more contested spaces in terms of term and domain. One does not necessarily speak to a body that seems, it doesn't seem to speak to a body that the system might deem interventionist. And it's difficult to kind of locate particular references to gender within gender. And I'll just give you this example, and we can talk about this later. I'm doing it in a shorthand way now. So a woman is what in this historical moment? A Facebook friend had this post in her feed a while ago. This is her post. Biological woman still equals derriere garde, human garbage. Thanks, internet, for keeping my ear to the fucking pavement. And the thing that happened after that is that she was critiqued for using the term biological woman, but what I was really interested in is this that what we might have to do in this contemporary moment is to kind of reframe our sense of selves when it comes to gender. What does woman mean in this particular moment, and how might we develop a poetics around this new frame? I think that this is a different conversation if we're thinking internationally. So again, I'm fascinated here by the possibility of a kind of feminist practice that is newly arranged and reconceptualized outside of the sphere of what we have historically thought about as the female body and its experience. So that's a big kind of bracket. That was a brackety moment. And given that the Black body is itself discomfort, the breaking, what would it mean for discomfort to be animated inside of dream and poetics? For discomfort to be a key motivational factor in and toward creativity. For us to remove the mouth cuff of silence and be ill-behaved and revel in the obscene, because what's truly happening is that everything is becoming obscene. Almost nothing can be said. 7, This is my last section, and it's titled Proposition. Only in the space of discomfort can we truly be creative. So this is one of those assertions I, might go with and might take away later. And so I'm actually going to play for you. I'll read you this bit, and then I'll show you some slides. So when we're most comfortable, like in making something, we're most in the zone, feeling the thing that we're doing as if running down a strong, clear path. We're in the space of making opposite to what I think of as creative and generative space of making. This feeling is a good feeling. We are, as artists, in the mode and practice of mastery. What we produce often feels familiar. It feels mostly finished. In poetry, we like to say when the poem is produced via this mode, this like good feeling when it's really working out, we like to say, that the poem came to us. It came to me, like it landed on my shoulder. And there it is, this little gem. But again, I think that this might not be the most productive space where one is most creative or dreamy. When we're like, oh, I killed it. Mastery is also a form of domination. It's a lording over skills, over the artwork. If we were to live in that space of always getting it exactly right, we might not be so interested in the process. Some of us, I said most of us before, but I just changed it to some of us, some of us prefer it to hurt a little. This is a conversation I have with my undergraduates all the time. They're like, I want to be a writer. I'm like, are you sure? Because it's awful, It's a lot of sitting and struggle and failure. And you have to live in that space a lot. Creativity is, in fact, most acutely engaged, I think, when we're in that space, when we are least familiar, when we have reached the end of what we already know. It is strongest in the uncomfortable space of not knowing. The in-between spaces that gather between knowing, the discomfort, the obscene. This is true to me in both the making of something and the experience of the work of art. This thing we call blackness, then, or the racially marked body, as it shifts in resistance to being mastered, as it attempts to master itself in that impossible space that I talked about earlier in terms of grief and melancholia. It shifts in that space, that impossible space of being both over-determined and over-analyzed, is central to thinking through an opposition or perhaps dimensionally outside the perfectly crafted gem. So what are we left with? What are we left with when there's no way to speak it without delimiting it? No way to speak its dimensions or rationality or interiority or design? What are we left with? And so here's some examples of artwork that I think speaks to that. Figure out how to work this. So these are images that some of you may have seen from Frederick Nauchicil, I think. I can't pronounce that. But he took some portraits of modern voguers in Baltimore. So I'll just show these slides, and then I'll just play the short video at the end, which I think is the most important part of this sequence. Whoops.
Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't fuck big what. Fuck, I don't give a fuck what. I don't fuck big what. Fuck, I don't give a fuck what. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't give a fuck what. Fuck, bitch, cunt. I don't what.
I'm not going to say very much because my time is pretty up, but I will say that what intrigues me about these images and about Red Shoes is this existence between the real and the fantasy and the way the signification of those terms shift. How the thing that is becomes performance so that it is difficult to mark the actual sometimes, the identity, what is put on and what is already. Identity, particularly in this case when it comes to race and gender, is an impossibility that not only calls into being the creative maker of identity, but in that encounter with the body that innovates outside of received notions of what it's supposed to be. I like Fred Moten's quote when he says, "There are whole new forms and modes and ideas of personhood that occur as a function of the experience of a person being taken as object. And it's difficult to bring received knowledges about what the interior beings of these bodies might be when they are not redundant in their performance of race and gender." What are wings? That's it, thank you.